The smell hit first. A sharp antiseptic ozone riding on top of the cleaner still drying in the conference room. It sat like a second skin over the expensive carpet, over the polished table, over every chair with its tidy stack of briefing packets. People wear masks and suits to hide things. Buildings wear smells. Simmons had already parked his swagger on the table. He tossed a poker chip between two long fingers as if it were a paperweight and not an offer. His grin was the sort that wants you to take a risk he's already calculated. 500, he said, and the money in his tone was literal. You go ask Voss for a date. Tell her it's personal. Walk back with a wee or a bruise. Either way, I get a buck. You get a story. He said it casual as an invitation to lunch. The boardroom hummed with the kind of harmless conversation that people use to practice cruelty. About roofing materials, about bids, about who's sleeping with whom in a city that confuses power with warmth. There were the usual allies, an easy smile from the contract ringleader, a small laugh from a junior PM who hadn't learned yet that jokes with stakes can become traps. I left my boots by the door of the boardroom and walked on the tile like a man pretending to belong. The mud on my boots had been scrubbed, but the tread still kept memory. That memory told me where I belonged, out where things were built, where rain told you what worked and what didn't. I carried that memory with me into sterile air conditioning and a conversation that sought to reduce everything to numbers and spin. You're not playing East, Simmons said. He pronounced my name like a test. East Hale. I answered with a look. I wasn't there to play. Clara's door was set of frosted glass, the kind that said, yes, we are high level, but not that we're untouchable. Her name, in crisp sans serif, matched the sharpness of her voice. I waited for her to look up the way I was supposed to wait for people who run things, patient, respectful, like a man who knows where the capstone lies, but won't rob the mason. She didn't look up when I closed the door. That was the first small invitation. Her hands were on a set of topographical maps, obsolete to some who thought in pixel-perfect renderings, but exact in the way she liked things. Real contours, slopes, where water wanted to run naturally if only you let it. Her desk had the freckled ink of someone who made lists and crossed them out for results. You got those drainage surveys? She asked without looking at me. The question was both professional and a door. Yes, I said. And the permit update. There's a swale on the north lot that was misspecified in the survey. If we don't reroute a section, compaction's going to fail next season. She finally looked up. The look was surgical. It saw what mattered and set to cutting. Show me. We walked together to the elevator. Office elevators are small confessionals. People come in carrying the day and leave with it changed by the time the doors open. The hum of the motor was familiar. My boot heels clicked faint against the metal floor. For the first time that day I felt the real weather, the kind that lives in the skin rather than the printout. The slow, persistent pressure of wanting something and not knowing what size of risk will open it. I'll see you on site, I said. And because there is always the question of how slow burn things begin, and because I had been thinking about the taste of rain on jeans and the way she moved when her hands got dirty, I added, after? Do you want to get coffee after the inspection? Talk more about the swale or not? She cut me off with a single line that landed like a stone in a pond, and the ripples came back at me months later in my head. I'm tired of waiting. It wasn't accusation. It wasn't a dare. It was a statement, a measurement of time that had stretched longer than patience meant to allow. She followed it with a question, not a request. What took you so long? There was a little laugh in my chest that tried to be defiant. There was also the memory of 100 small hesitations that let a man be competent and let him be cautious. And sometimes those two things are the same. I answered with the truth I had been rehearsing for years. It took me the right moment, I said, or the courage to say it. That felt too theatrical even to my ear. She didn't flinch. She fed the moment because she liked precision. The elevator dinged. She stepped out like a surgeon stepping into a bright theater. I followed. At the elevator, I paused, and because I needed something less like a line and more like a real bridge, I said plainly, If you don't want coffee, that's fine. I'll leave it at the report. There are formal things and informal things, and everything about asking someone with as much control as Clara Voss required a map and a compass. I offered both. She gave a small nod that said she heard, and that she would decide on her own terms. If Simmons had been watching, he would have called it a victory for the amused kind of cruelty. He would have made ledger entries out of a compliment and read the balance sheet out loud. But he was not in the elevator. He was outside it, sitting across the boardroom table with a bet in his pocket. After that, the day bent toward rain. Driving out to Emerald Ridge is a way of remembering how asphalt is a promise, and how quickly promises flatten into mud. The highway smudged into side roads flanked by thin trees. The sky sat low, the color of a bruise you get before you bump something. Not dramatic, just patient. The truck's cab smelled like coffee, old cloth, and the faint mineral tang of a man who sleeps sometimes with his phone set to alarms that say, "Get up, move." I like trucks for the way they keep clothes honest. They let you sit with a stain and not pretend the world is always polished. Clara drove behind me because she likes to see work firsthand, and she likes the kind of control that comes from seeing the front lines before the meeting. There's an economy to her movements in a vehicle. Hands at 10 and 2, eyes that map the road, jaw set like a hinge. She had taken second place in the organization to be intentionally there, and that means she measured risk, not avoided it. We met at the gate to the site. The crew had already pulled tarps over materials, but rain finds its way into every plan and every trench like it knows the best time to visit. The site office was a small thing with a card table and folding chairs, a kettle on a single-burner hot plate, a weathered bulletin board with permits thumbtacked like ornaments. She stepped out, heels jangling against the truck bed where a foil-covered safety helmet waited for her. She didn't hesitate. She kicked the heeled shoe off, barefoot and decisive, and reached for the boots I'd left leaning by the trailer. She made a joke about commitment to mud and then put her foot into a real work boot like she had done it before. She did not ask for help. She slid the boot on with the same precise motion she used to check a plan. I handed her a neon vest. She accepted it like paper that held weight. There is a kind of intimacy in shared competence. We started with maps spread on the truck bed, the real ones, not the glossy printed ones that say rendering. We bent over the same corner of a sheet and argued until we found the truth of the land. Her hands would tap a contour and then fold into the map, fingers scarred in places that told 1,000 small proprietary tales. I saw the way her brow furrowed when something didn't align, and I felt ridiculous, perhaps like I was finally being allowed to see her work under the light it deserved. Rain came in as a steady drummer. The crew kept moving because they had to. When you stop, water wins. She walked to the edge of the trench and peered into the red-brown belly of the earth. The men on the crew talk differently when a woman of authority is near, not less, just differently, with more clarity. She asked a question about compaction, and the superintendent answered like she had cut to a core fact, and not a vague political preference. There was an exchange of information, and every line had a precise weight. We dug our hands into testing spoils together. I handed her a pocket penetrometer like a child giving another child a toy. She pressed the instrument into the soil and then passed it back to me with a look that said everything and nothing, the comfortable part of a joke. There was a small smear of mud on her knuckle that did not look wrong. We didn't flirt like people doing stage performances. There was no pretense of coy glances. The gestures were the flint of practical touch, passing a wedge, steadying a ladder, putting a mittened hand on the back of a worker to redirect him from the slip line. Each contact had consent embedded in it because it was functional first and kind after. When I adjusted her jacket because the wind had tugged it loose, she turned into me and let me do it. Her jaw tightened for a breath and then relaxed. There are quarters of a person reserved for the exact people who know how to hold them. And for a few considerate moments, the crew's murmur and the rain were the world's permission. We took a break under the trailer's awning. The kettle whistled. She gave me a paper cup. We rested and watched the crew move like a well-oiled instrument, and in the small domesticity of damp gloves and steam curling around disposable cardboard, we spoke loosely about things I had never thought would be part of a conversation with the vice president of development. Bits of horticulture, her first job on a site when she had been young enough to think that management and mercy were the same thing. She spoke of mentors, not as trophies but as instruments who'd taught her how to read water as if it were a language. She let me talk about the time a drainage failure almost sank a whole neighborhood, and the way a single corrected swale and a community meeting made the city breathe again. You learn a lot about a person when they talk about the things that saved other people. It gives you a map of their priorities. At one point, the superintendent called us over. They had found a tangle of cable near the north slope, not the typical utility line, nothing in the survey, something like a wire coiled and left like a question mark. The crew joked about uncharted treasure, which is how men who live with machinery dress their nerves in humor. I knelt and pulled the coil gently. The cable was looped around a small weathered plastic body, an audio recorder, the kind that looks unremarkable until you remember people use unremarkable things to do remarkable betrayals. The device didn't record on its own. It was a box. It had to be turned on. It had batteries that would carry weight if someone had the patience. The rain beaded on it like a body with secrets. I didn't touch it more than was necessary. Evidence, when left outside to the weather, becomes less reliable. But someone wanted this to be found. Someone wanted it placed where the crew would find it at a certain time, on a certain schedule, under certain witnesses. Clara looked at it with the same expression she used when reading a contract. Dispassionate at first, then narrow with attention. "Who planted that?" she asked. The superintendent shrugged, the way men shrug when a question's answer is not news they want, but news they have to move through. "Not ours." Simmons was a long way away from us, on purpose. On the ride up, he'd made small jokes about how hands-on women don't stay untarnished for long. His brand is like a paperweight that rolls where it wants. There are men who treat sites like stages and people like props. Simmons is an entire production company of that type. We handed the recorder to the superintendent. Standard procedure is to bag it and tag it to fill a chain of custody form. She said so. "Bag it," she said. "Tag it. Catalog it now. Don't let anyone else touch it." The crew obeyed because she had given an order that meant something beyond immediate inconvenience. It was an order in the language of safety and proof. I watched her file an entry in the yellow ledger in the trailer, her handwriting precise. In a world of digital breadcrumbs, she still liked hard paper for certain things. It anchors you, makes you traceable in a manner electronic signatures will not always grant. I liked that about her. It made her human and not only an avatar in a presentation. We put the recorder into a plastic evidence bag. As I sealed it, my fingers found a faint ridge where someone had scrawled a mark with a permanent pen. An initial? A number? Or perhaps nothing. I photographed the tag with my phone because I didn't trust memory and because photographs, like maps, keep the world honest. The metadata would embed the time and place, a small measure of truth that cannot be unmade by a later lie without cost. Back at my truck, the radio in the cab made small talk about traffic jams somewhere else and weather alerts for our county. The water on the windows made the world look stitched into gray. I sat in the driver's seat with the recorder bag on my lap, the plastic making a soft crinkle sound, and something in me tightened. I had a habit of listening to the tape in the dark when I thought I saw trouble. Not to steal, not to spy, but because sometimes the world left you acoustic footprints and you had to follow them. I didn't switch it on. That would have been amateurish and possibly illegal in some places. And I am not a man who relies on illegal shortcuts. I am a man who trusts paper trails and timestamps and the formality of rules because rules, however rigid, give you ways to make fightable ground. Still, the presence of the device was a statement. Someone had wanted to capture something here. That someone might be benign, a university researcher, an annoying journalist. But the context made other possibilities louder. Simmons has a very particular fondness for the dramatic. When the world is a stage, he would rather be the playwright. That afternoon, in the dull rain and the muttered repairs, people worked. Clara re-centered the conversation back to water flow and to the swale. There is a kind of intimacy to returning to work after a complication. It is the human ticket to stay upright. She asked precise questions about the footing on the northern bank. I showed her the lip I had recommended be reinforced, the way a finger traces an outline of what will stand. She nodded as if filing the information in a drawer labeled, "Carefully." When the day wound toward dusk, a man from the crew came up with news. Simmons's crew had been seen on the other side of the site earlier, canvassing with a supposed quality inspector credential that didn't match the permits. He'd been polite, too polite, leaving pamphlets about partnership and about expedited approvals. The superintendent said he checked their badge numbers and they didn't align with any city registry. "Looks like they're shopping for someone to convince," he said. Clara's jaw set. "Who authorized Simmons to be near this? He's been maintained as a contractor to the board, not to this site." The distinction mattered. Means to influence are rarely direct. They often come in the form of familiarity and the steady drip of proximity. We took inventory then. Who had been on site that day? Who had left? Who had come in? The superintendent handed over the sign-in sheet. People tend to write names incorrectly when they don't want to be noticed. Little scribbles become the scaffolding for later suspicion. At the edge of the lot, a truck left quickly, its taillights a smear in the rain. We watched it go. The road swallowed it like a throat swallowing a stone. The world continued to make choices of speed and distance without asking permission. That evening, I drove Clara back to the gate in silence that wasn't uncomfortable. She was quiet, the way someone rehearses the way a day has gone before making a decision about it. At the gate, she turned to me. "You did what you had to do," she said. It was both gratitude and a distance measured carefully. "Thank you." It felt good and not enough, which as a phrase is almost a definition of being alive and noticing someone else. I wanted to say more, to tie the day together with a ribbon and a trivial metaphor about how rain sometimes washes things to light, but the ribbon felt too small. I settled for, "We'll keep a log. We'll watch." Which sounded pedestrian but is also the vocabulary of people who make the world safer with incremental verbs. She walked off toward her car with the same perfect posture she had in heels, and for a moment I felt like a man who'd been permitted to view a private constellation and had to keep the pattern safe. In the truck, I opened a folder and began to index the day's notes. The recorder in my bag made the faintest crinkle when I shifted. I thumbed through photographs I'd taken, contour lines, a close-up of the recorder in the dirt, a picture of Clara's knuckles as she had clapped dirt off her jeans like she used hands to close the conversation. The metadata on each photograph told me the time and the place, and the small truth that evidence keeps. There are people who believe evidence is a blunt instrument. I think it's a language. You can speak it loudly or fashion it into a sentence that will hold up under scrutiny. I prefer sentences. They are easier to defend. I was about to shut the folder when my phone buzzed. It lit up with a text from an unknown number that said only, "Good show today." No signature, no salutation, a poker chip of a sentence. The timestamp matched the noon meeting in the boardroom, right around when Simmons smiled his way through a conversation about bets. If somebody wanted to be petty, they'd send a note with more venom. If they wanted to be dangerous, they'd send a note that made you feel watched. This made me feel observed. I pocketed the phone and the recorder and drove home under a sky that had the patience of someone waiting for a verdict. I slept poorly, which is to say I slept like a man who hears the world through a thin membrane and knows that leaks happen not in a day but in the slow corrosion of small choices. The next morning found us back in the same building of scent and carpet, except the carpet seemed less incidental now. It was part of the scene. Simmons was back at his table, his fingers idly spinning another chip as if he enjoyed the sound it made. A few people laughed when he did. Laughs are currency in rooms where power schedules decisions like payments. I had filed my notes. I'd registered the recorder in the log at the trailer and had also forwarded photographs and a short chain of custody note to Clara's office under a secure heading. She had acknowledged receipt with one-line efficiency. "Noted," she had written. She had also sent a copy to the in-house counsel. That was the kind of move that insists you will not be surprised. That afternoon, a frantic junior PM poked his head into my temporary office. His face had the color of a man who had looked at an email meant to be private and felt the corrosive air of intention. He handed me his phone. On the screen was an edited audio clip. It was a snippet of a meeting, the kind of thing you might assume fit the ambient noise of a construction site. Laughter, shovels, a reference to a private line. The clip had been sliced, edited, put on a loop. The edit made a sentence read like a private moment between two people in the trailer, a phrase that, taken out of context, sounded like an admission. "The voice is cropped," the junior said. He was not a man built for these long calculations. He wanted someone more solid than him to say whether the world was turning into a cartoon. I listened. The edit felt amateur but effective. Someone had taken a moment and removed the foundation that made it obvious it was a joke or an instruction. That was the trick of seduction in offices. Remove context, and meaning shifts like sand. The clip was sent to the chairman. It was a neat package meant to orbit suspicion. Someone had a plan. Make it look like there had been impropriety. The target, me, and by gravity, the Voss office that had spent months building a reputation for straight lines and clean answers. Simmons's grin had a new edge. He didn't have to say anything. The clip did the talking. It painted a narrative where proximity equals consent and where a single joke could be manufactured into a scandal. I called a meeting with the junior PM and a trusted site foreman. "Did you record anything?" I asked. "No," the foreman said. He was the sort of man who preferred the burly truth that comes from muscles and weather. But whoever did, they left abrasions. The tape's been cleaned up. Whoever put it together knew the cadence of our operation. I felt the old solid line of myself, someone who shows up with facts and who avoids theatrics. The tape was a problem to be solved, not a drama to be recast. We made a plan without melodrama. Consolidate logs, gather timestamps, secure access points. We would let facts be the scaffolding for a defense, not the flourishes of a counter-accusation. When I walked back into Clara's office, she looked up with the same expression she gives to weather reports. Measured, a statistic shifted into a plan. "They'll try to reroute the public's eye," she said. "They'll use a slice and call it the whole. We'll show the whole." Her voice quieted when she added, "And East," she said my name like the hinge it was. "If they try to make this a story about anything other than oversight and structure, they'll be wrong. There are moments when you meet eyes with someone and understand that there is a shared ledger being built. We do not balance it with sugar. We balance it with truth." She slid a blue pen across the desk. "Document everything you did on site yesterday. Time, actions. I want a full report to council by tonight." I took the pen. "You don't look surprised." "Not surprised," she said. "Just not complacent." It felt like a promise without romance. It was the kind of sentence that could later become something else. For now, it was a contract between two people who were building the same defense. That night, I sat at my desk with the day's logs and the recorder's photograph open on my screen. I went through every timestamp of my messages, emails, sign-ins. The office's security camera logs confirmed when people entered and left, like honest footnotes. When someone wants to manufacture impropriety, they rely on blank spaces in the timeline. I had fewer blank spaces than most men, which made me an inconvenient target. Then there was the call I didn't expect. It was a voice from the legal team asking for a copy of the recorder's photograph and for a statement about why the device had been on the site at all. "We have to treat this as evidence," the lawyer said, the voice all procedural calm. "Formality is a thin type of mercy." We complied. We treated it as evidence because that is the only language power often understands. I put my phone down and for the first time that week, allowed myself the small indulgence of thinking about the other question. The one that had nothing to do with logs or evidence or spin. The one that had a shape like a cup in the rain. Why did I wait? There were reasons that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with consequence. I had a habit of pausing before the step that made things differently obvious. I told myself it was prudence. There are costs to entangling the personal with the professional. But then I remembered her hands on the penetrometer and the way she let the earth have its say. She had not asked me for rescue. She had asked me for partnership. My phone buzzed again. Another message, this time a photograph with a caption. It was a picture of Simmons at the boardroom table with a chip balanced on his knuckles. The caption read, "Let the games begin." The tone was smug, the kind of alleyway note you get from someone who mistakes ceremony for substance. I looked at the recorder photo again, at the faint scrawl on the tag that could mean anything or nothing. I thought of chain of custody forms and of evidence bags and of a woman who will not be used as a prop on a stage someone else built. I thought of the elevator and of the way she had cut the air with a short sentence and left me to figure out whether it was a command or a kindness. I thought of the water in the trench and of the way careful work can anchor a life. At 2 a.m, I wrote down a simple line: document, protect, wait. It reads like a diary of a mundane hero. There is no cape, only a notebook that knows how to hold time. I left my desk with the first warmth of dawn pressing at the city. The rain had returned like an old ally. I drove to the site because truth doesn't always wait for permission to be proven in courtrooms. Sometimes it demands an afternoon of mud to find its feet. When I pulled into the lot, the cranes were silent, their long arms hoisted like sleeping birds. The crew was already there, huddled under tarps, drinking cheap thermos coffee. There were more questions than answers at that hour. A man in a reflective vest motioned me over and said, "We found this near the crane's base." He handed me a thin strip of plastic. It had been torn cleanly from a badge and left like a clue. The tear looked intentional. I turned it over. There was a faint print of what might have been a serial number. It could have been nothing, or it could have been something. At the edge of the lot, a white van I'd never seen before idled. It had a company logo that didn't match any of the contractors on the permit list. The van's back door was shut. The driver watched the site with a posture that said he enjoyed watching things move. There was a smell of oil and wet earth. The crane stood like silent jurors. The strip of badge in my hand felt like permission and warning at once. I pocketed it and walked to the crane operator's cabin. He was an old man with weather in the creases of his face and luck in his slow hands. He looked at me like a man who knew when to scare and when to comfort. "Everything all right?" he asked. "All right as it gets," I said, "but keep it slow. If the ground's soft, we don't work heavy lifts today." He nodded like he knew the cost of a wrong decision. He keyed his headset and spoke in short sentences, the language of someone who moves the city with a lever. We set up checks. No heroics, just the steady conversation of people avoiding catastrophe. And somewhere, not yet audible, was the sound of a plan clicking into motion. Someone removing a badge. Someone sitting in a van, watching like a hawk. It was the hush before a change. I felt the weight of it in the small chill that ran at the base of my skull. The same place where you feel when a day's rhythm collects a new irregularity. I walked back to the trailer. The recorder was in the evidence bag in my truck's glove compartment, tagged and photographed, logged in 2 different places. I thought of how small objects take on enormous meaning when someone decides to use them as proof. I thought of how careers can be rerouted by a single cut of a clip and how, when someone has the appetite for spectacle, it's better to be 2 steps ahead. A gust of wind lifted the edge of the tarp and revealed a glint of metal in the mud that wasn't supposed to be there. A bolt, fresh, clean, not yet rusted. It had been replaced recently. Someone had fiddled with an outrigger's anchor point and done it in a way that exacts a delayed price. My steps tightened, my chest pressed like a hand wrapped in a glove that was too small. Scene by scene, the picture was shading into something more malignant, not a harmless prank, not simply a smear. A plan. I called Clara. She picked up on the second ring. There was no small talk in her voice. "What's the status?" "Badge strip," I said. "Recorders bagged. Bolt replaced near the outrigger. White van in the lot." She inhaled like someone cataloging a list of incidents. "Get me everything on the badge strip and the van plate," she said. "Take no one's word. Call the superintendent and run the crane's logs. If anyone's tampered with anchors, we log it now. I want photographs, serial numbers, witness statements. East, lock down the evidence." I told her I had. "Stay safe," she added, clear, not sentimental. "And East, one more thing. If it becomes a circus, don't stand in the ring alone." I smiled despite myself because the sentence sounded like concern and strategy braided together. "I won't," I said. "You?" There was no need to ask whether she'd be careful. It was in her nature. She was cautious by design. "I'll be on the phone," she said. "Do what you do." We hung up and the call felt like a kind of contract. two people with different currencies, hers, authority, mine, boots, agreeing to buy the same thing, which was truth. I walked to the fence and watched the van for a long time, long enough to learn that patience could be a weapon. The driver shifted, the van idled, and then, as if deciding the moment had passed or that patience had been unsuccessful, it pulled away. The taillights were tidy, polite, disappearing into the gray. I stayed until the cranes had been inspected and logged and until the new bolt had been marked as suspect, and then tested. Protocols are not glamorous. They are paragraphs and signatures, and they abrasion-proof reputations. If someone wanted to break infrastructure, they had to do it in a way that made the law slow to speak. That slowness is where men like Simmons try to hide their smoke. Night came again, and the city blurred into 1,000 lights. I walked back to my truck with the day in a folder and the recorder in my lap, and a sense that the day's story would not be told gently. There would be a conflict that required evidence and the patience of people willing to show it in the light. When I pulled into the driveway of my tiny apartment, I found an envelope slipped under the door. No stamp, just paper. It held a single small object, a brass key on a ring, dull with use. A note in a looping hand said only, "For when you want more than a meeting place." I could have thrown it away. I could have photographed it and handed it to counsel. I did neither immediately. I held it until the brass warmed to my palm, and then I put it in a small box with the recorder photograph and the badge strip. Keys are the currency of promises. Sometimes people give them as a joke. Sometimes they give them as a bet. Sometimes they are a little of both. I slept poorly again, but not because of the evidence. I was awake with a particular kind of awake that tastes like possibility and danger braided together. The key in the box made a tiny metallic consolation sound whenever I shifted. By the time morning came, a report had been filed with the board. Simmons had been discreetly asked to step into a different meeting that afternoon, one where he would be seated with men who liked the smell of conference room ozone and who had a fondness for numbers. He left the site with a small practice smile that was starting to look dangerous. I went to Clara's office to deliver the hard copies of the day's logs. She accepted them without ceremony. We stood in the doorway watching the city with the tired, steady look of people who had been awake too long. "If this is a setup," she said, "we will have to be more thorough than the person who tried it." "And if it's not?" I asked. "Then we did our job," she said. "Either way, we leave no loose ends." There was a moment of silence that felt like an unstruck bell. I thought of the elevator and of her question and of the way a single sentence can be both a demand and a relief. I thought of the key, the recorder, the badge strip, and the bolt. I thought of the rain, and of the trench, and the way the world sometimes demands you to be brave not for yourself, but because the people under your care need you to be awake. At noon, the board called a brief session. There was an air of low expectation in the room, people leaning into a canned performance of control. Simmons sat at the far end with a contemptuous kind of ease, the kind of posture that comes from being used to a room reshaping itself to accommodate your narratives. Clara presented the day's facts with her usual economy. She slid photographs across the table and laid out the chain of custody like a surgeon laying out instruments. People in the room took in the facts like they were chewing something unfamiliar. The chairman peered at the recorder photo and then at me, like one inspecting an artifact. "You found an audio device," he said, "and evidence of tampering." "Yes," Clara said. Her voice did not crack. It didn't need to. "And we have documented attempted access to crane outriggers, which could have created a failure during a full lift. We can show patterns that point to malintent." There was a low murmur. People in a room of men and women trained to play with probability calculate differently when the scale shifts from profit to potential physical harm. They are quick to promise investigations and slow to make immediate moves that suggest panic because panic is an admission of weakness. Simmons tapped his fingers. "Perhaps the device was planted by a competitor," he offered with a bored air. "You can't police the entire perimeter at all times." "You can if you care about your contractors," Clara shot back. Her look was an edge. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her precision became a scalpel. This site had an incident-prone detail replaced. Someone placed a device inside our operational envelope. The person who did this sought the appearance of impropriety. No one spoke for a moment. You could feel each person choosing which side of the ledger to be on. Then a voice from legal, thin and calm, said, "We need to secure evidence and press for an immediate audit of who had access to the site in the last 48 hours. Simmons's smirk shrank like a coin taken from a magician. He adjusted his tie. You could see the calculation in his eyes, whether to turn the meeting into theater or to avoid it. After the meeting, there was a shuffle of men who wanted to be seen doing things. The chairman made a perfunctory speech about safety and integrity and the need to take swift action if wrongdoing was found. These are sentences that, in the right conditions, become actions. Clara did not clap for them. She read them like directions on a form, which was to say, with attention, but not romance. When the room cleared, she asked me to stay. Her office had the late-day sun coming through, warming the frosted glass to honey. She closed the door and folded her hands on the table like someone offering a formal choice. "Why did you come forward, East?" she asked. "There are questions you answer once with narrative and then allow the echoes to do the rest." I could have said I came forward for integrity, for the truth, for the plain fact that people die when anchors fail, and when the wrong bravado is taken for expertise. I could have given a speech about values. Instead I said, because it's not just about me. There was truth in that, and not enough of it. She nodded. She had wanted the simple answer. She had a hunger for the straight line. She looked at me like someone calculating a risk and deciding if she could afford generosity. You came because the truth mattered," she finished for me, not as praise but as a ledger entry. Her fingers drummed once on the table, precise as a metronome. "Good. That's the correct answer." I looked at her, and for a second the room shrank to the two of us and a scatter of paper. "I came because people can get hurt when anchors fail," I said. "Because a tampered bolt is not a metaphor. It's a problem that kills if left to luck." She let that sit. "We move forward then," she said, "but we do it in light. No theater. If this is speaking to you, stick around. This one gets messy and then it gets honest." We paced the next 24 hours like surgeons planning an operation. There was a rhythm to it that felt comforting. Document, timestamp, notify, consolidate. Clara's counsel set up a controlled review of access logs and contractor authorizations. I coordinated with the superintendent to recheck all outriggers and to double-tag serial numbers. The crane operator and his crew ran through a dry rehearsal of their motions. Nothing dramatic, only discipline. Discipline, I thought, was a kind of tenderness to the job. It meant not leaving someone else's life to improvisation. That afternoon, the board scheduled a demonstration at Emerald Ridge. It was a smart move. Show the site, show the logs, show the people who had been there and who had not. It would make the smear harder to orbit a room. Simmons agreed to attend. His smile had that slow, smug flavor of men used to rooms bending for them. He called it confidence. The rest of us called it a risk to the narrative. We met at the gate under a sky that swelled low and patient, not theatrical, but threatening enough to polish nerves. Clara walked the site with the chairman and a half-dozen board members at her heels. Each set of eyes trained the way predators train on a movement. I stayed near the crane because the crane was the most honest witness we had. Machinery does not lie for charm. It only follows physics and bolts. The plan was to perform a controlled lift. A pallet with ballast, hoisted a modest height to test the outrigger loads and the boom's behavior. The supervisor ran through the checklist aloud. Narrative discipline for a room that needed not to imagine catastrophe but to watch procedures performed. The operator's headset whispered commands in the low, steady cadences of a man whose hands had learned what to fear. We'd checked the replaced bolt that morning and found it marked and then removed for a forensic test. The new bolt had been logged into evidence as questionable, and the original anchor tested. There was a comfort in the formalities. They forced anyone hoping to spin fiction into the cramped space of dates and names. Simmons stood to the side with the chairman, his posture that of a man who mistakes scheduled time for mastery. "You'll see," he said to the chairman with that easy voice. "Construction is messy. People make mistakes. Clara didn't let the comment slide into the room's temperature. "Mistakes and sabotage are different things," she said simply. "And we have documentation that suggests someone tried to create the appearance of a mistake." We began the lift. The pallet rose 15 feet and the operator set it to swing a slow practice circle to show balance. The attendees murmured, nodding at the smooth arc of metal and rope. I stood with my hands in my jacket pockets. Not because I was cold, but because hands keep a man honest in a room that likes spectacle. Halfway through the demonstration, the boom gave a stutter that wasn't mechanical hesitation, but the sound a heartbeat makes when someone startle squeezes it. The pallet yawed. The operator cursed softly into his headset and called for a slow stop. The machine obeyed, but there was a wet, hollow shift under the outrigger that made 100 small men in the crowd look at 100 different feet. "You feel that?" the operator asked through clenched teeth, more to himself than to anyone else. The supervisor called for an immediate test stop and for the crew to ground the load. That was when the ground gave a sound like air being let out of a drum. The near outrigger, the one we'd inspected, shifted enough for the weight to tip the plane of forces. A slow, dangerous list began. Adrenaline cuts words into little sharp things. I ran, not because I was the star of a movie, but because in a moment like that, every second you waste translating hesitation into motion is a second where the physics of people and things can become permanent. I radioed the superintendent, quiet and precise. "Hold the boom. Lower to travel. No sudden lifts. Evacuate arc." My voice was not theatrical. It didn't need to be. The crew heard it as an order, like the operator's voice, and moved with the muscle memory of people who have seen what happens when the ground and the machine disagree. The pallet swung, the load shifted, and for a heart-popping 2 seconds the boom leaned as if considering what it might do if gravity had a mind to be cruel. The operator brought it down. It kissed the ground the way a careful man might set a sleeping child in a bed. We had bought inches with seconds. Seconds are the currency of things that survive. When the pallet touched down, the crowd exhaled as one animal. Men with radios began washing through procedures like hands washing off oil. I walked to the outrigger and found, by a line no one else might have noticed if not for the way I read hardware, that a washer had been substituted with one that was undersized by tolerance. It was not a dramatic sabotage in Hollywood terms. It was the quiet, efficient kind that aims to fail a system at a key moment. Simmons's face had drained from leisure to calculation. He had been betting on narrative, not on bolts. Now his eyes narrowed, the way a gambler's eyes narrow when the house proves a stubborn operator. Clara didn't gasp. She catalogued. "Document everything," she said. "Photos from this angle, cross-sections from the operator's console, witness statements now. We lock this as potential deliberate tampering." The chairman turned to Simmons like a man turning a ledger page to a line that had gone up in red. "Care to explain why a replacement that fails tolerance is in our set of parts?" he asked. The question sits in a room like a hand on a table,